Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for coming in. This is the endorsement for Measure 113. If the three of you, could each introduce yourselves, and then one of you give us a brief summary of what you're proposing. We'll start with you.
I'm Cassie Purdy. I'm the political director at Planned Parenthood Advocates of Oregon.
Joe Baser. I'm the associate director at Oregon AFSCME.
And I'm Hannah Love. I'm a campaign consultant for Yes on Measure 113. So first of all, thanks for having us. We're really excited to be here. You just read a lot about our measure out loud, and so you probably know that Measure 113 is a really simple measure, actually, that solves a really big crisis. The issue of politicians violating their oath of office, leaving behind their one constitutional duty, which is voting on bills when they don't get their way. As you all probably know better than most, Oregon Republicans have staged 6 walkouts over the last few sessions. Some were sustained, some were short and in protest, and they threatened to walk out many more times than that. This walkout, which used to be a last resort tactic for lawmakers of either party in the minority, has really become status quo operating procedure for certain politicians in Salem. And as a result, we've seen really important policies died, failed, postponed, important funding for essential services postponed or stalled, and the functioning of state government just pretty fundamentally undermined in Oregon. So that was the problem we were trying to solve with Measure 113. What it will do is ensure that legislators face genuine consequences if they skip work in Salem more than 10 times without an excuse. And the goal is really of these consequences is to require legislators to just weigh the costs and benefits of their behavior and their actions of walking off the job, so that these walkouts only happen in the rarest and most dire of circumstances, forcing the people in both parties to work together rather than just walk away when they don't get their way. So under Measure 113, if a legislator misses 10 or more floor sessions, so just floor sessions in a single legislative session, whether that's a short session or a long session or a special session, this measure would prohibit them from keeping their seat the next term. They're not kicked out automatically, but they wouldn't be able to keep that seat after the next time they're up for election. And it accomplishes that in a really simple 3-sentence measure change to the Constitution that qualifies 10 or more unexcused absences as disorderly conduct and creates an automatic consequence of not being able to hold your seat after the next term.
So it's not any absence.
It's unexcused absences.
It's an unexcused absence.
That's right.
And who gets to decide what's excusable?
So the rules for determining excused and unexcused absences are currently set in legislative rule, which means each chamber gets to vote on it at the beginning of each session. So it's not statutory, it's not in the Constitution. And right now, the current process is that there's a piece of paperwork that gets filled out by a legislator and turned into either the chief clerk or the secretary of the Senate, the nonpartisan offices that oversee both chambers. They process the paperwork and give it to the presiding officer, who ultimately decides if it's excused or unexcused.
So the determination about whether your absence is excused occurs after you've made the absence, right? And it's only if someone complains.
No, they proactively fill out a form.
When I'm leaving. If I have to take an absence, I fill out a form. And I say, here's the reason for my absence. And then someone judges whether it's excusable or not?
That's right.
And who makes that determination? Is it who's in power?
Yes, it's ultimately the presiding officer of the chamber.
So in theory, you could have the presiding officer of a chamber, let's say Republicans were in control, and it was a whack job. And I was a legislator, and I said, I have to leave because I have cancer, or I have to be excused because my wife has cancer. The majority party could say, that's an unexcused absence.
Either of you want to answer that? Happy?
I mean, theoretically, possibly, but I don't, I think it has never happened. No one's ever used unexcused absences to beat up on another legislator.
Well, there's been less of a motivation to do so than there would be if this passed. And I want to, I have to create another reason, or for whatever reason, or the punitive nature of the party in power wants to punish people because they think they're using an excuse that may or may not be an excuse. Let me ask you this, and I'm sorry we're cutting you off, but we're
No,
very familiar
please.
with this measure, and the opposition
Yeah.
side isn't here, so we have to play that role.
Absolutely.
Why? This paper has always had a very, very difficult, has been very uncomfortable with changes to the Constitution. Much more comfortable with statute.
Mm-hmm.
So why does this require a constitutional change? Couldn't it have been done statutorily? I realize it probably wasn't the three of you
Yeah.
who decided, it probably actually was you. But why did you go that route?
We would have loved to not change the Constitution.
Yeah,
honestly.
we didn't think legally we could do it just statutorily.
You got legal
We talked-
advice that said you couldn't do this statutorily?
We knocked it around a bunch of different ways. I think statutorily, then the party power changes, and they're like, man, they change it. I think there was desire to keep it in the Constitution. Felt it was important.
I realize that if you pass it statutorily, the Republicans take power, they can change it. But that doesn't mean legally you can't do this statutorily.
I'm not sure that that's true, and I'm not a lawyer, but I believe that the law that governs legislative absences, and mostly not absences, because like I said, that's in rule, but that governs punishments for legislators is in the Constitution. And so I think to have these consequences, I don't remember, those conversations were a long time ago and I wasn't privy to all of them, but I do think that's the reason why it's constitutional. And to get to your point about does this give too much power to the presiding officers, I think in theory, what you're saying could be true. I also think it would be really dangerous for us to put in the Constitution definitions for things that are currently defined in legislative rule, because right now lawmakers do have.
I'm not suggesting that you carve into the Constitution what is considered to be a reasonable excuse for absence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just suggesting that there are ways in which they could be abused. So again, the same response. Democrats have used this tactic. You've heard this before. Democrats in Oregon did it. Democrats have done it in other states. Why, if it's good for the goose, is it not good for the gander?
Well, you can still do it. You can still do it under this measure, but it has to be important enough that you're willing to lose your seat over it. And I think because right now what they're doing is every time they get a little bit upset, they're walking out.
No, I understand that, but that's not responsive to my question.
Well, I think it is because I think
There has been plenty of evidence where the Democratic Party has used this and thought it was a perfectly appropriate way to express themselves, and their response would be the ballot boxes where you tell these people they lose their job, not some constitutional change that decides artificially after 10 absences. So why was it not appropriate to change the Constitution then, and it is now?
well, but I'm saying you can still deny quorum under this measure. There's nothing stops you from denying quorum under this measure, and we wouldn't want to.
Joe, with all due respect, you're not answering the question. Why was it okay then, and is it not okay now to the point where you want to change the Constitution?
I think it's about the frequency of the tactic and what it's done to the functioning of state government. I think
So it's not the tactic itself, it's the fact that it's happening too often.
yes.
Yeah. I think to your point about the voters being able to decide who gets elected and who doesn't, they have to be able to have a track record of those lawmakers and what decisions they've made. And in 2020, only 3 bills passed, and they didn't get to look at that track record to decide what kind of lawmaker they wanted in office.
Well, they had a track record of these people not participating in the legislative process.
I think-
Right? That's a very evident track record that they can then use and vote.
I think if we were talking about individual lawmaker behavior, what you're saying would be true. If Senator Hurd's constituents wanted to vote him out because he decided to protest the mask requirement and go step outside the chamber for every vote this session, that would be one thing. But I think what we're talking about is much more systemic than individual behavior, and that's why a system-wide change is more appropriate here.
Any other states do this?
Do it this way.
Does any other state have in its constitution the ability to basically say a legislator, I don't care what the voters think, cannot come back to work if they have unexcused absences of 8, 10, 12, whatever? Is this modeled after any state, or is this
No,
a
it's
first
not. It's not modeled after any
Okay,
other
is
state.
this a first of a kind in the country?
I'm not sure. We didn't look at other states.
You didn't take a look at how this might impact legislating in other states. You just said, we want to punish those Republicans, and we can because we're in power.
Very few states have quorum requirements as stringent as Oregon's to begin with, so I think it's not really an apples to apples
And how'd you come
comparison.
up with the number 10?
It felt reasonable.
I mean, I'm just wondering, tactically, is there anything about 10? I mean, could they get around this by having every legislator, every Republican legislator have 9 unexcused absences?
Sure.
Well, if that's the case, then you're not really solving the problem. There must have been some decision math about why 10.
But it's also, it goes back to to the frequency issue. Like, if there's one thing that's so important, then then you can schedule, you could probably piece together a piecemeal way to like stop that one bit of legislation. But they were stopping everything for very little reason. And I think that makes 10 makes it very hard to shut everything down for months and months at a time.
But without necessarily stopping people from being able to stage their protest over whatever they want to make news about, right? Like, we're not trying to make walking out or denying quorum illegal or take it off the table. We just want there to be real consequences that someone has to weigh. It has to be important enough.
So right now, someone can be removed from office if people don't vote for him. What are other ways, absent this, can you remove a legislator from office? If they're convicted of a felony? Anything else?
I think they need a, 2/3 majority, like we saw with
To vote a member out?
I think it's 3/4 though.
3/4.
Yeah.
That the 3/4 of a legislature can vote out any member of the legislature for any reason?
Right, that's happened with McNairman.
And that's like an immediate expulsion, which is a little different than what we're proposing.
And you decided
here.
not to go that route.
Well,
Because-
quorum's 2/3 and expulsion is 3/4. The math doesn't really work out.
Well, let's say 3/4 is the wrong fraction. I guess
Okay.
what I'm saying is, did you contemplate, rather than having this automatic cutoff, basically saying if you have a certain number of excused absences, we're going to put this to a vote of the House or the Senate as to whether or not you should continue here, or you don't trust them enough?
I'm not sure
Joe,
that
I got to tell you,
Yeah.
this really sounds punitive, and despite all the bad things they've done, but it sounds punitive in part because you can.
Well,
Because you happen to operate from a position of almost monopolistic authority in this state to be able to do this. There are a lot of states where this simply would not fly. And so that's obviously
I'm so
wrong.
impressed at the amount of power I have, but only in this room.
Yeah, only in this room.
Yeah.
But given that that is a widespread perception, how does this bring us together?
I think it's ridiculous to think we have that much power. If we did, then we wouldn't have to spend all the money to put it on the ballot, right? We would have just got the legislature just to refer it. We could have saved a bunch of money.
Did you seek to go that route?
No, there was no way we were going to.
Because you asked.
We didn't have the support from the
So
legislature.
you asked Democrats and they said no way.
No.
There was a hearing on it and the Republicans didn't show up, so it
Okay, but
couldn't
nevertheless.
move.
That was also a big thing.
Walked out?
Yeah.
But speak to the average Oregonian who feels that way.
Well, I think the average Oregonian, if they didn't show up for work for 10 days in a row, and they would not be getting paid, and they would lose their job. I think the average Oregonian understands that, like, you sign up for a job. Most average Oregonians don't have to take an oath to do their job. And if you don't do your job, you shouldn't get paid. You shouldn't face no consequences. And that's what they're doing. And they're shutting down, they're stopping legislation from passing. Bipartisan, good, important legislation is getting stopped for people having their feelings hurt.
So, all right, I'll stop. I have one more question, by the way.
Could we game a walkout? Like, what happens? So people say we had to walk out like we did over the climate bill. Do the Democrats then? Could the Democrats then say we're holding 10 votes while they walked out, and then all of a sudden everybody who walked out is in danger?
It's separate floor sessions, so normally they'll gavel in for the day.
Okay.
And what they've been doing is they will then recess for the whole day, basically, maybe gavel back in and say, hey, are you guys here yet? Gavel back out. And so that would be one floor session, is the entire day.
So that's 1 of 10.
Yeah.
So they do that again the next day, and the next day, 10 times, and then they're vulnerable to these
Penalties. They don't have to come back.
Huh?
They don't have to come back. they could stay out if there's something important enough to them
Stay
that they
out for
kill.
24 sessions. if they
Yeah.
want to.
But they would have to face these consequences, yes, after their next election.
And that would discourage, you think that would discourage the walkouts that,
I think it would discourage the frequency. I think if there was some issue that was truly fundamentally important to them, that they are willing to no longer be legislators anymore, then they'll walk out. I think though what they're walking out over as, they're grumpy about their committee assignment, or they're going to start walking out because they didn't feel like one of their amendments didn't make it into a bill. They're walking out. They're threatening a walkout over almost anything, and I think that's what this is getting after. It's the using it all the time, and not just using the actual tactic, but using the threat of the tactic to stop legislation from moving forward.
and do the threats work?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They do. They're like,
Yeah.
okay, we're not going to get here. We might as well not even do this.
Yeah.
Let's not even try.
I mean, I think it's hard to prove a negative like that, but the organizations that do advocacy work in the Capitol every day have to make decisions about what kind of policy they're willing to put forward, and if they feel like a policy that's too bold or too big is going to trigger a walkout, then they may not bring it forward. So you can't say for certain what policies didn't get to move in 2021 or 2022 because
Of threats.
of threats of walkouts.
These examples are where people actually did walk out?
Those are bills that, with I think the exception of one that's on there, but are bills that didn't pass, were proposed and didn't pass in 2020 because there was essentially no session.
This is a result of actual people not
This
being in
is the
building.
2021.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This isn't threat.
Right, this
But
isn't
what
threats.
you're saying is you can't really quantify the threats because there's so many and you don't, where threats worked for them.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, for an organization like ours, we know where most Republicans stand on abortion rights and abortion access, and know that those often get put on the kill list automatically once they're introduced. And
So
the threat of if
the mere threat stops you.
potentially.
Yeah.
And it
It's hard to
threatens
quantify.
the hundreds of other bills that need to get passed, funding that needs to get passed. And so I think it does force an organization who cares about lots of different things, like OHP funding, for example,
Yeah.
to say, okay, what am I going to put forward if we know that this has the potential of blowing up the entire session?
Is there an organized campaign against?
No.
And how much is your campaign? What's your budget?
The majority of our budget was putting this measure on the ballot,
How much was that?
close to 1.6 million.
And to pass it, how much are you?
Very minimal. We are submitting voters' pamphlet statements,
Mhm.
and we might do a little bit of broad communication. But we're talking like $100,000 at
Have you
most.
done polling since you got it on the ballot?
No, we have not.
Has anyone done polling and shared it with you?
Not that I'm aware of. We've included a poll memo in your packet that is
Okay.
polling we did at the beginning of last year that shows a pretty broadly popular measure. Our take is that politicians have not gotten more popular since we did that polling, and we haven't seen any opposition spending that would move numbers enough.
All right, so we're about done, right?
I have a couple questions.
Oh, you do? I mean, I have one final question.
He was in charge of the
I
interview.
know. I just have to do the introduction. I'm required by statute. Not
Should have walked out. Should have walked out.
Not constitutional, but what can you do?
Did you vote on that, or?
We don't vote around here. So, you mentioned early on that this has become status quo for certain Oregon politicians. Well, let's talk about one in particular, who's on the ballot for governor. Is this not basically Christine Drayson's signature tactic?
That's a good question. I don't. They've all done it. I feel like it started in the Senate. The House did definitely start taking it over. I mean, I don't know.
I guess my question is, to what degree did one candidate for governor make this something of a signature as you've tried to deal with this?
I don't know. It's good. I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it that way. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm trying to remember if she was minority leader when this problem first started, or whether it's something that she was proud to pick up the mantle of. I don't know.
She was. So in 2019, the House Democrats did not join the Senate
That's
Republicans in the walkout. And in 2020, after Drazen took leadership,
That
in
was
fact,
when
she
they
took
did
leadership
walkout.
of the caucus
Yeah.
because she decided that this was going to be her signature policy, and the rest of the Republicans, Carl Wilson, didn't want to do it.
That's right.
Her taking over essentially turned this into a status quo, everyday tactic on the House side, if not in the Senate. I wouldn't credit her with the Senate.
Sure.
So I guess the question would be like, to what degree is your frustration, in fact, with Christine Drazen?
I think like she's definitely part of the frustration. Like I think for us, the Senate sort of, I'm not gonna lie, the Senate sort of takes like, we lost public defense reform in 2020. That was the part, that was, because we represent public defenders. It's a system in crisis. Like before the pandemic, we had a big package we really thought could do some real significant benefit to those folks. That was the thing that like was the gut punch, because it had bipartisan support. It was literally the bill that was up next when the walkout happened. And that's so like, whether Drazen hasn't really been a focus in my mind because of that one incident, and that was the Senate, right? That was the part that sort of like has drawn frankly all my ire and all my like, this is why we have to do this.
That's interesting. So your argument is that the public defense catastrophe in this state can be credited to Senate Democrats walking out.
Well, the public defense catastrophe in the state
Republican.
is like, let's just be honest, it's one of the most significant problems we face in this state and in the country. But I definitely
I would not disagree.
There was movement, and then once the pandemic happened, then like it just sort of snowballed and got worse and worse and worse. I don't want to pretend like my bill would have fixed it. Our bill would have fixed it. No, I'm not that I don't have that much power. But I do think that, that was like, it wasn't getting enough attention then, and it wasn't getting enough, and we were able to make some significant movement, and that was, I don't think it would have fixed it, is what I'm trying to say, with lots and lots of words, but it would have helped.
Okay.
And I think to Hannah's earlier point too, like this is an attempt to address a systemic problem in the legislature. It's not targeted at any one lawmaker, and we put it on the ballot knowing full well that the balance of power could shift in the legislature, and that this would still be something that they had to follow.
We also didn't know she was going to run for governor when we put her on the ballot.
That's true.
With all due respect, that's not true. This is not a systemic issue. You're trying to wrestle with some particularly corrigible Republicans.
I do think it's a systemic issue, and I included this Oregonian editorial in your packet, not to force you to read it.
Coming here and bringing an Oregonian
But there was a
is not a
specific,
smart move.
there was
Maybe
a
that's just your
specific
power.
line in there that I really wanted to call attention to, because I hadn't read this until I was getting ready to do these editorial boards, and it jumped out at me. It says, attacking Democratic lawmakers for pursuing the policies that voters endorsed by choosing them is nothing more than an attempt to overturn the election. And that struck me because talking about Republicans trying to overturn an election meant something very different in March 2020 than it does today. And I think it speaks to kind of the system-wide crisis that we're in, and this is one way it's manifesting in Oregon.
So let me ask you to step back and acknowledge a couple things. At least in my 40 plus years in this state, I've never felt like the state was more divided. So let's assume that this meeting is transported to Harney County, and I don't know if you've ever been to Harney County, but the politics are quite a bit different. And did you say you work for Planned Parenthood and you work for?
The campaign.
Okay. So, and let's assume that you're sitting in a room and you know, for example, that I'm pro-life, but you're also desperately aware of how divided this state is, and somehow we've got to find some common ground. And I say to you, I disagree with you respectfully, but frankly, Republicans are so overwhelmed in this state that if this is the only way that they can block legislation that I think is bad for the state, remember we're in Harney County, why are you preventing them from expressing themselves with an understanding that you have all the money and power in the world if you want to come out to Eastern Oregon and run a Democratic candidate against my state senator in Harney County? But why are you changing the Constitution, which is simply not going to find common ground? It's going to send me in Harney County even further away from finding any common ground, and in fact give fuel to the secession movement. How does that speak to the larger issue of us trying to find abilities to get in the same room and talk together, rather than saying, we've got the power right now, so we've got a shotgun, and we're going to use it.
I guess I would
So, I'm in
say-
Pendleton,
yeah.
or I'm in Harney County, talk to me.
I guess I would say two things. The first is that I think you're right. The state is really divided, and we have huge issues facing our state. I don't think anyone denies that. And I think the last thing that Oregonians want is for their politicians to walk away instead of coming to the table to try to solve these massive problems. We don't elect people so that they can stop progress in its tracks. We elect them so that they can work to find solutions. And I think secondly, and maybe I wouldn't say this if I'm in a Harney County editorial board meeting, but maybe I would, is that this is a democracy, and if Republicans want more say over the policies that get passed, they should win more elections. And that's what democracy is, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at here, which is that, you know, by trying to not take issue with the process, which is not what they're doing, they're taking issues with the policy that voters have endorsed by electing Democrats. They're trying to overturn
And so how do
a
you
Democrat.
respond to someone who says, the process is, if you want to punish these Republicans for not participating, you don't change the Constitution, you win more elections, what you just said to me. What do you say to them? You can't say, we don't have the money. You got it. I mean, how do we bridge this divide? Because it strikes me that this constitutional change will do nothing to bridge the divide. It will do nothing. And to suggest that this is systemic, no. If there weren't a bunch of election deniers in Salem right now, you probably wouldn't be floating this. If this was filled with the Bob Packwoods and the Vicatias of yore. But we happen to have a particular group of people, and so you're responding to the moment. And I'm not sure you're responding in a way that is going to heal us.
I do think, though, I do think if the tactic of walking out is reserved for the thing that they find to be systemic, right? I do think it's going to cause them to not threaten every couple minutes. They're not going to every single time. They won't use it. They won't use it knee jerk. They're going to have to, because right now they've stopped negotiating on bills. They've stopped trying to insert or push their agenda. And legislators, they're like, the Democrats don't ride roughshod. I know that everyone wants to believe that. They don't ride roughshod over them. They make a lot of concessions to the other party.
I'm well aware of some of the crazies you're dealing with down there. That's not.
But they're going to make them. I actually think that it increases the likelihood, increases the opportunity for Republicans to get in the room, actually have those negotiations. Because right now they're like, I don't even have that. We'll just walk out.
Okay.
If you don't do my bill, we're out.
All right.
I'm also not sure how having Dallas Hurds and Herman Berkshires rather than Vicatias and Bob Packwoods is not systemic.
Okay, subject for a longer conversation.
Much longer conversation. Absolutely.
I'm frankly surprised you folks haven't done any polling. I just, how is that possible?
We don't have that much money. Like, I know you keep saying we have an infinite amount of money. We're totally
You want this to
outspent.
pass.
What?
You guys
Have
are
look at the
sophisticated.
CDs? We're totally outspent all the time, constantly.
You spend all this money to put on the ballot, and then you just say, we don't really need to know whether or not.
We pulled the ballot title when we got it,
Mhm.
and then there isn't any organized opposition.
Okay.
So I am frankly a steward of my members' money, and like I'm not going to spend it on things I don't think are worth it.
All right. We don't ask the silly question of
We do not.
measures.
There's no silly question on
What
it.
is
For fun,
it?
though. Come on.
We'll ask you, but
Yeah,
not put it in the
it's
paper.
good.
Do you
The
care
world's
about it?
ending tomorrow. What's the last food you'd eat? Not
Start.
real food. That's what we're asking candidates.
Really?
Yeah.
Betsy Johnson said a case of vodka.
No, she
She
didn't.
did?
She hasn't actually been in the room yet.
Jesus.
It's not a bad
Somebody this
answer.
morning
It
said
might be
a
the
really
thing I
She
agree
drinks
with her
whiskey.
most
That's my
about.
guess.
What?
I think she's a whiskey person. I don't know.
Oh. You don't have to answer. That's the question. But we really appreciate you coming in here and submitting yourself to this grilling.
We appreciate you having us.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
We'd love to earn your endorsement.
Just,
Yeah.
just one last thing. The Constitution.
Yeah. as Hannah said, it was a while ago, and I'm not 100. I'm trying to recall a conversation we had like.
But you could
2
have done
years
this
ago.
statutorily. Your concern is it'd be overturned by the Republicans if they were ever.
Sure we could.
I don't think we could have.
I don't think we could.
tried.
I think we thought about it, and we got advice that it should be in the Constitution.
Because it might be
Because once again, it would have saved us a lot
unconstitutional
of money. We wouldn't have to get as many signatures.
You got through the full text rule and everything? That's a feat these days.
I
Yeah.
know.
So many of these.
Nice to meet you.